Morning Talk with Siki Mgabadeli.
On SAFM 104 to 107. It's time now for Workers on Wednesday, and this particular feature is co-produced with Workers World Media Productions. And what we're going to be doing is that every first Wednesday of the month, we're going to dedicate it to labor issues in Africa, and Chinese history and archaeological evidence in East Africa indicates that its trade relationship with Africa dates back to the Han dynasty between 202 BC and 220 AD. There were exports of goods from Africa to China and imports of Chinese goods to Africa during that time. During the 60s and 70s, Chinese relations with African countries was driven by ideological considerations, with China presenting itself as an alternative to both the capitalist West and the Soviet Union. And during that time, China's support consisted mainly of political and material support for anti-colonial liberation struggles. And then during the 80s, the relationship then shifted towards economic cooperation based on common aims, and China attached importance to both political and economic benefits and portrayed itself as an attractive economic partner and political friend. In fact, for African governments, this presented an alternative to the Washington Consensus and was termed the Beijing Consensus, as China was going to support without interference in the country's internal affairs. So now those particular trade relations, known as the Sino-African trade relations, are characterized by Africa being a supplier of raw materials to China. So this morning, we're talking about the impact of Chinese investments on African economies and, of course, the working people in African countries. And I'll take your calls on this one. Is it a good relationship? Is it a bad relationship? Who is the one who benefits from it? You can call us on 0891104207. SMSs to 34701. My guest this morning, Herbert Joch, who is a labor researcher and co-editor of the book Chinese Investments in Africa, a Labor Perspective. Mundia Sikufele, he is with the National Union of Miners and Allied Workers, and Yeju Kim is a research analyst at the Center for Chinese Studies based at the University of Stellenbosch. Thank you so much to all of you for your time this morning.
Thanks for the invitation.
It's a pleasure. I just want to check if everybody's there. Mundia, are you there?
Hello.
Hi.
Alive. Good morning.
Good morning. And is that Yeju?
Yeah, hi.
Hi, there we go. All right, fantastic. Just wanted to make sure everyone's on the line. Herbert, let me start with you. I mean, is it as simple as saying it's a good relationship or a bad relationship when you look at the current state of play between Africa and China?
No, it's a rather complex question, and our particular study was actually requested by unions in Africa on the continent. Various federations and also industrial unions said in the last few years we had an increasing presence of Chinese business in our various countries, and there are many concerns about labor issues. And that's where the African Labor Research Networks, which is an organization of research institutes close to labor movements, started to develop the idea of a continental study looking at the various aspects. And the difficulty in making a blank judgment is the following.
Yeah.
There is no doubt that the last 30 years of Washington consensus policies on the continent, of structural adjustment programs and the like, have been absolutely devastating for the continent. It was really the continent becoming an imperial playground against its resources, actually plundered with very, very little returns for Africans. In that sense, the emergence of China as a new global player, as a new economic superpower, has given Africa kind of choices, alternatives to this Western complete dominance on the continent. That in itself is welcome. But when we looked at when Chinese businesses come to Africa, number one, are the economic relations fundamentally different to those that we had with Western countries? The answer is no, because in many cases China, like formerly the West, is importing raw materials from Africa. There is, however, a little bit of manufacturing processing also happening, which is to be welcome. And then the third aspect we paid, of course, particular attention to is how are African workers treated at those Chinese companies that investing all over the continent. And that's perhaps the worst case of the three aspects, because we found that the general pattern is unfortunately that workers at Chinese companies tend to be the lowest paid, that very little attention is paid to health and safety issues, that national labor rights are often violated with impunity. And so the answer to it is China's presence a blessing or a curse for Africa. Depends on which angle you take in looking at it.
That's interesting because you talk about, blatant abuse or ignoring of the local labor laws. Whose fault is that? Surely African countries should have learned from the past, the Washington consensus, that they need to be a little bit stricter about what sort of investment, firstly, that they attract, but also the conditions that are attached to that investment.
Absolutely, and that's where we take issue with our own governments, that they have been, number one, seemingly a bit blinded by the political rhetoric and the long-standing friendly relationships between Africa and China, that they sometimes see the Chinese investments as a way of bailing them out as a government or a country in crisis. And therefore they tend to close their eyes on these labor issues. And our point was with the study to say we must become selective. We must move away from the notion that investment is generally good. It is not. We need to be selective and say these kinds of investments under the following conditions, so that there is a longer-term developmental impact. And that must include that investments are held to account and that violations of local laws and labor standards are not going to be tolerated. And we found there across the continent that governments are either politically unwilling to do that, or in some cases they also lack capacity to enforce and monitor developments. And for that, of course, one can hardly blame the Chinese. They're using the opportunities that are there. But it's a question to ourselves and our governments to change that, to turn that around and make sure that investments fit into a broader developmental agenda. Okay. That includes adherence to labor standards.
Let me hear what Yeju Kim thinks about that, about who really holds the power in this trade relationship and what the dynamics are. Yeju?
Oh, yeah. I think foreign companies, including China, are likely to follow their home country's practices. So we have to think about labor relations and working conditions in China first. Until recently, the country has maintained low wages. Actually, that has attracted FDI a lot. Yeah. But now the Chinese government is focusing on improving labor relations by increasing the minimum wage and introducing new regulations itself. And also, Chinese enterprises overseas have become aware of the importance of complying with host countries' regulations. So thus, I must say, Chinese enterprises are in a learning process. Yeah. And again, I totally agree with Hubert. The role of African governments or civil society and trade unions should play an important role in monitoring these investors' practices. And I agree there have been many violations, but my major line is they are not always Chinese, or sometimes European. Also, we can see a lot of Asian emerging partners like Korean and Taiwanese. So rather we have to think about solutions, how to regulate them. So again, much more depends on, I think, African government's willingness or capacity. Yeah.
What approach do Chinese companies take in investing on the continent? Is it an individual corporation taking a leap, or is it a collective strategy?
Well, there have been new trends these days because in the past, Chinese investments used to be led by state-owned companies, but now more private businesses are coming to the African continent. So in this way, I think investments from China, the US, they are all similar. They are following opportunities, which is the nature of businesses actually.
We're going to pick up on that, but also I want to hear from Mundia talking a little bit about the working conditions at Chinese-owned mines, specifically in Zambia. And we're going to take calls on this one as well on 0891104207. SMS is 34701.
Morning Talk with Siki Mgabadeli.
Talking about Chinese investments in Africa. This relationship sustainable, and who are the beneficiaries of it? My guest this morning, Herbert Joch, who's a labor researcher and co-editor of the book Chinese Investments in Africa, A Labor Perspective. Mundia Sikofele is with the National Union of Miners and Allied Workers, and Yeju Kim is a research analyst at the Center for Chinese Studies based at the University of Stellenbosch. So Mundia, let me bring you into this conversation, and maybe you can talk us through the working conditions at Chinese-owned mines in Zambia. Oh dear, I think we might have lost Mundia. Yeju, are you still with me?
Yeah.
Fantastic. And Herbert?
Also,
You're still there as well. All right, we'll hear from Mundia. But in general, Yeju, you've said that obviously in China right now, China is going through a transition. They're busy looking at working conditions in China. But their approach on the African continent, what have you found?
I think, as I've already mentioned, the foreign companies, they are following their home country's practices. So I think this is great, like a learning process for those who is operating in Africa. Chinese enterprises overseas, they started awareing the importance of complying with the host country's regulations. Yeah.
And in terms of industries that are popular, we talked about the export of raw materials, so particularly in mining. But are companies divesting from that, or at least diversifying the investment proposition on the continent?
I think in terms of Chinese investment, also I want to add some more aspect as well. As we mentioned earlier, the volume of capital, as we all know, in energy and infrastructure sectors are substantial. But also the number of people involved, I think retail should be noted. Even some argue as many as 80% of Chinese companies operating in Africa, they are small and medium-sized companies. If I can give you an easy example, you can see the Chinese shop everywhere in this country. And lastly, I want to highlight something important, new trends in Chinese investment in Africa, especially in the service sectors such as telecommunication, tourism, and banking. I think these new trends is very important because they can contribute to the diversification of Africa's economy. So still, Africa's economy still remains the heavy and extractive industries. So there are different dimensions we can think about it, and then Chinese investments can contribute to Africa.
And what do you make of that, Herbert? The diversification away from extractive industries?
It's absolutely essential, but it needs to be driven by Africans themselves, and that has been the problem. That currently the initiative is, of course, taken by the economic superpowers, be it the EU, the US, and now China, and probably India joining soon. They have very strategic agendas in terms of trade relations and economic relations with Africa, and of course they can't be blamed for it. They're looking, it's a kind of enlightened self-interest. Now the problem is they then strategically look at Africa's resources in terms of their own benefits, and they make offers and suggestions and prepare agreements. And if we uncritically just sign them, we will end up in a very similar situation. And that's where African initiative and African leadership has to come in, not only from governments, but also from the labor movement, to say, look, for a company that, for example, gets mining licenses, let's say in Zambia, a precondition must be at least partial beneficiation. Before goods are exported. So you basically say, well, if you are interested in our resources, our interest is to create jobs on the continent and move away from being an exporter of raw materials. A particular problematic aspect, like my colleague has mentioned now, are the so-called SMEs from China. These are often played out in the forms of what we call the China shops. Around every corner now, you find small retailers. And what they have done is not to create a new industry. Retail and small businesses you find all over Africa. These are the established survival industries, often linking into the informal economy. And what we have seen is a placement, namely that these China shops then import cheap goods from elsewhere and displace local traders. And that has, in terms of developmental, in terms of incomes on the continent, a rather negative aspect. And it was very interesting when, after the publication of our book, we discussed some of the findings with some of the Chinese diplomats here. They actually admitted and said, look, we understand that concern, but these are private business people that are outside the control of the Chinese government. But they said, we agree with the point that small Chinese retailers coming to Africa have no positive developmental impact. And then the question is, why then are we allowing that to happen? Why are we allowing the displacement of local small traders through China shops? And we have seen in several countries already violent confrontations when African traders felt that their livelihood is now being undermined by this competition of China shops that are linked to global production chains that can source then at the lowest possible prices.
Yeah.
And that has become a conflict, and there we didn't have a really continental debate of saying, is this kind of investment beneficial to Africans and Africa's development at all? And if we do that, we would actually have to say this practice has to be stopped. But one must also say it's not only the Chinese. That would also be wrong to single them out.
Yeah.
It is this general opening of the economy without clear criteria of what we as Africans want to see
and
what's needed from a developmental perspective. And unless that changes, we're going to run into these problems time and again and again.
All right. Let's hear from Alfie in Ramsey. Hi, Alfie.
Your honorable guest. Siki, I maintain that the China factor to Africa is tantamount to colonialization. I believe that, simple principles when you go into international business theory and practice, visiting countries must adapt and do as Romans do in Rome. In terms of, practicing businesses in Africa, they should adhere to the rules and regulations of the host countries. And I see that not happening. Number two, the study, I look forward to reading the book, but most of the studies, they never talk about Africans, responsibility and accountability in the whole matter. The speaker spoke about we letting them do these things, but the fact of the matter is that most of the factors are presented as if Africa is a victim. And for one, we don't talk about the personal attitude of Chinese, the ambition and vision of Asian countries to be the best in the world. And we don't take that as a responsibility and having to account to that and position ourselves in a right place. For example, China happens to be appearing where they donate. I think politically they get involved with ruling parties, but you don't hear much about them putting money into education, for example, or transferring of skills. So these are things that I hope to find in the book, but if I don't find them in the book, I'd like to get your guest, to submit or make a comment.
All right, I'll find out where you can get in touch, where you can get that book. Thanks, Alfie. David in Graafrenet, morning.
Hi, Tsiki.
Hi there.
Tsiki, I'd just like to really second what the previous caller has just said. If you look at this situation honestly, I think we're basically witnessing a mad scramble to get hands on Africa's resources. And I think it was put perfectly when it said it's a new type of colonialism, but it's an economic colonialism. And basically it boils down to plundering the Earth's resources. And in the process, the two things that have happened in China when they've used up their own resources is the pollution of air and water. And if you remember back to the Beijing Olympics, how contaminated the air in China was, and they had to spray it with water cannons just to clean it for the Olympics. So people that walk around China with masks on just to prevent breathing the air. So China's record with respect to how it treats the planet is not a great one. And I think them arriving here in Africa, it fills me with a lot of trepidation. Siki, just a few things I'd like to comment on. First of all, that China as a country has one of the most enormous populations, and they need to feed and service that population, and their resources in China have been used up, and now they need to look elsewhere for resources. And I think Africa is one of the places they're going.
Yeah. And what should we do about it, though, David? I mean, we've also got to take some responsibility. If we're not insisting that the rules of the game in this country or on our continent are followed, then can you blame the person who breaks the rules?
Well, I'll give you an example, Siki. I've traveled quite a bit in southern Africa, and in a small town called Pangan in northern Mozambique.
Yeah.
There was a Chinese chap that was operating a shark fin setup there. You know that the Chinese slaughter more than 40 million sharks per year to make shark fin soup. Now, this chap, there was no regulation. He was in a place that was so remote. There was no ways the Mozambique government could have known what he was up to. every day he would go out, and when I'd look at his catch at the end of the day, it was so depressing to see this boat full of shark fin. And I could see there was absolutely no authority. So there are places in Africa where just the lack of infrastructure is being abused by people like that. There were trees coming out of northern Mozambique, the hardwood trees, just the raw logs being put onto ships. There was no benefit to the Mozambique people at all.
Yeah.
The same thing happens in Gabon. I was recently in Gaborone. The airport there has just been redone by the Chinese. The people sweeping up and even cleaning in the airport were Chinese. There was no local people involved. And I think a point was made earlier that the Chinese are very cunning at getting involved with the right politicians to be able to get away with getting in there and getting the resources out without benefiting Africa. And I think that in years to come, we're going to seriously look back at what the Chinese do to our country, and we're going to think back and say, well,
what did really allow to happen?
Africa is one of the continents that is still incredibly beautiful. It's got so many resources, and it's been preserved by the African way.
All right. Well, I've got to let you go, David, if you don't mind. Thanks for your time this morning, David and Graaf-Reinet. We'll talk about that. Lots of issues raised. I'll give you a chance, Herbert and Yeju, and I think Mundia is back with us as well. Give you a chance to respond to that, and we'll also hear what's going on in Zambia, in the mines there. Right. So read some of your SMSs sent through to 34701, and Fred says most Chinese things are inferior. And someone says the China shops, especially in the huge Chinese malls, have no cash registers. So how do they pay VAT and income tax? Why are unions and SARS quiet about this corruption? Delani Dlamini in Pietermaritzburg says, Siki, can they not Hong Kong us? Will they tell us who we should invite? And Kosima Katuka says the way out of dependency is nationalism, Pan-Africanism and socialism. We can Africa. We need an African consensus. Right, let's hear what my guests think about that. And Herbert, I'll start with you. And the general feeling from both of our callers is that this is a new form of colonization.
That's a very common perception that we also found amongst many workers that are employed at Chinese companies. If I can give you just one kind of example that we found here in my own country, in Namibia, we have a minimum wage in the construction industry that was agreed between the union and the employer's body.
Yeah.
And that minimum wage stands now just above 10 rand per hour. And we found that most Chinese construction companies, many of them actually state-owned, that get the big government tenders, that workers receive 3 rand or 3 rand 50. Such blatant violations are happening here, and that gives the sense of they are new colonizers. They come in to exploit us even more than the previous colonizers did. So that is a common sense. But then you have, on the other hand, our political leadership that sees China as a solution, and there one must say the Chinese intervention have been extremely skillful in terms of winning governments over, not coming with blatant prescriptions like the Western European countries and the US are generally doing. And that has made the link to China at a political level very attractive for local political elites. And that they have used very skillfully. But I agree with one of the SMS and also what your caller said, that there is the time for Africans to say, what is our agenda? Before we
invite
what
anyone else.
is. They're very long-term thinking and very strategic. And we seem to fall time and again into the same pattern of thinking. Someone from outside will somehow save the continent, and we tend to think this will be foreign investors. I think as long as we are hanging on to that misconception, we'll be disappointed time and again and again. And we mustn't forget that China is not a socialist country anymore the way it used to be in Mao Zedong's time. It is today playing a ruthless game of a ruthless global capitalist system, and it's playing along by the same rule. And we mustn't forget the polluters in China were not just Chinese businesses. China has become the workshop of the world. Western multinational companies have gone there in large numbers and producing there under those horrific conditions. So we must see the emergence of China within that economic system and not as an isolated case. And the solution for Africa would really have to be none but ourselves have to start to change that.
Okay. Yeju, your thoughts on what the callers were saying?
First of all, I want to say something about like the myth and the new types of colonialism in terms of like China, because like China has been seen as a threat because of its massive size. I'm not necessarily defending China, but for example, like China imported nearly 9% of Africa's oil in 2009. But when we think about
Yeju, just pause. Yeju, just pause there for me. Yeju, just pause there for me for a moment. It seems we've lost someone on the line. I don't know who that is. We'll see if we can sort that out. And I'll just take the rest of your points that you wanted to make about recolonization and the myth around that. We'll do that in a moment.
Morning Talk with Siki Mgabadeli.
It's 17 minutes to 11 here on SAFM 104 to 107. I'm going to take the calls of Brian, Aloysius and Paul. Stay on the line. Let's just allow Yeju to finish her point. And you were making the point about the fear that China's sheer size engenders in people.
Yes, I just mentioned about like new types of colonialism. I think it's kind of myth because China imported nearly 9% of Africa's oil in 2009. But when we look at other countries like the U.S. and U.K., they imported like more about like 30% of Africa's oil. So I think it's a little bit irrelevant, but I want to mention about that thing. And then now I think we have to think about how to maximize the benefits from China's investments. Especially like European countries, they are now suffering from crisis. Which traditional partners to African continent. So in this situation, what African need is continuous capital flow for the infrastructure and everything. So I think in that way, China can play important role for African countries like further development and growth.
Let's talk a bit about the pollution and the concerns about China's environmental policies.
I'm not, the environmental policy is not my, the special work area.
Field, yeah.
But actually, they are focusing on the improving, improving on their local regulations and then things to rectify their previous, the mistakes or,
So in their relationship with other parts of the world, except for Africa, is the approach the same? So do they approach investing in Europe or the United States in the same way that they do with African countries?
Well, I think as Hubert mentioned, Chinese is one of the investors. So I think, their approach is quite similar. They are just following opportunities, business opportunities. Yes.
All right. So let's take some calls. Brian in Newcastle. Good morning.
Hi, good morning, Nsiki. How are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Good. Nsiki, what I'd like to say is I think everybody knows that Newcastle at one stage was one of the major textile producers for the country with Chinese factories and workers.
Yeah.
What you find now is I would say at least 60 to 70% of them have pulled out. And what they've left is very questionable. They are here just to exploit the workers. They've really not given anything back to the community other than while they were running stores. Now, the other big thing is we even have a town who is an ANC MP in Parliament.
You have a what? Sorry? We lost you.
ANC Member of Parliament.
Yeah.
Who's Chinese. And he's a factory owner in Newcastle. But you never hear of this gentleman or fighting for the cause of the workers.
And that factory is still running?
His factory is still running, yes, without a doubt. But the bottom line is, as I say, you can drive through our town and you'll see the vast amount of factories that are just standing vacant now. After major government subsidies were given to them, but unfortunately they were all caught out because of the policies regarding.
Oof, Brian, I wish your line was better. It's terrible, but we've got the gist of your point, so I'm going to have to let you go. Thanks, Brian. Aloysius, you're calling us from Japan. Good morning.
Good morning, Siki.
Hi.
And good morning to your guest here. My opinion is the Chinese and African relationship is an advantageous relationship, more especially to African countries. I've heard some of your callers say that China is recolonizing Africa. In my opinion, that does not hold. China is not recolonizing Africa. I think the West developed before China, and China did a lot to learn from the West. I think this relationship is an opportunity for African countries to learn from China. One of your guests made an opinion that said that China must make an effort to impart technology to African countries. I don't think it is within the reach of China to enforce such a thing. I think it's within the reach of African countries in making partnership agreement with China to infer that technology should be transferred to African citizens. So if that is left open by the African government, you don't expect Chinese government to do that because it costs them a lot to get that technology. And if that technology is imparted free of charge, they will lose market. So it's a capitalist thing and it's a protectionist issue. Okay. China will want as much as possible protect herself. So it is up to African government to protect Africa as well.
Okay.
We don't have to leave it to China to execute and protect at the same time. It doesn't happen.
All right. Thanks for your call, Aloysius, calling us from Japan. Mpo in Orlando, morning.
Hello, it's Pipo.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, my take, Siki, firstly, I think the major problem lies in the mind. Our mind, apartheid has done serious damage in terms of thinking. I think the vast majority, the thinking is not aligned properly. But obviously, that's a challenge we need to sort out going forward. But I believe...
Sipo? Oh, no. All right, we've lost Sipo. Herman in Cape Town. Hi, Herman.
Hi, Siki. How are you?
I'm well, Herman.
Fine, thanks. My contribution to this interesting topic is that maybe you should invite the ambassador of China to South Africa and also outline on the issues that has to do with China's 50-year plan, especially in Africa. I've been privileged to travel in some of these African countries, and I can tell you, I've been sharing with my friends that Chinese have taken over Africa already. Just went to Lusaka a few weeks ago. The government complex, the IT department, fully run by Chinese. You go to ZNBC, you look at the equipment they're using. They've been donated, and they claim they're worth 4 billion, donated by Chinese in exchange of free tenders that were the equivalent of those equipments. And you find that nobody even evaluated whether those equipments which have been donated free were that 4 billion. And you find a stadium being built, given to Chinese construction company. Guess where the material is coming from? Guess where the labor is coming from? Everything from China. As much as we can maybe blaming Chinese, but I think we should, as Africans, we should blame our greedy politicians, because Chinese are not invading without permission. They are invading, whether they are colonizing, whatever we name it, they are doing that with the blessings of our politicians. Okay. And I think it's time for us, as citizens, as Africans, to stand up against our own, to say we can't allow this to continue to happen like this.
All right.
And some of them, these people in African countries, some of them, like in Angola, the same thing is happening. When we interact with them as South African, they will say, yeah, but South Africa, you are not there to help us in terms of developing our countries, in terms of infrastructure. And I'm saying that even South Africa, we have to wake up and invest in our own African countries, because if we don't, who is? And the Chinese will come in and will be singing the same song of complaint to say that Chinese are colonizing us.
Yeah, but they have size on their side. We have a population of 50 million. We can't compare with over 1 billion.
But in terms of resources, how much are South African companies sitting in terms of capital, which they're not investing in South Africa and also not investing in our African countries?
No, there is a lot of money that's being sat on at the moment, but let's also not forget that many South African companies are operating on the continent.
They are, but to what scale? To what scale?
Yeah, that's the point I was making about scale. We're competing here with literally a giant, and we are a dwarf, I suppose. Even if we plowed every single cent that private companies in South Africa are sitting on at the moment and not reinvesting, we'd still not be able to compete. That's my point.
Then we have an advantage as Africans of the resources that we have. Then let's have it on our terms and conditions like other callers have been saying.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you there. Absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks, Herman.
Thanks.
Bye. Mutala in Durban, good morning.
Historically speaking, the Chinese have done much favor to Africa. In the 1960s, when President Kaunda said that the natural resources, copper, 51% should belong to them. What did the West do? What those people who were exploiting, they blockaded him, closed the railway line. When Kaunda asked the World Bank and the West to build a railway line to connect to Mozambique, to Tanzania, they said impossible, we can't do it. Kaunda went to the Chinese. They came, they help. They built it at a cheap price. They didn't charge interest as the West would have done. And the copper could proceed. The Chinese said, we will exploit it and we will give you 51% in the copper mine.
Yes.
And they are helping Africa. When they provide cheap goods, they are helping the poor, the majority in South Africa, because otherwise you would buy the expensive item from the West and from others who are exploiting us.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mutala. And I'm going to take one more call from Ziba in Secunda, and then I'll give my guests a chance to respond to the calls and the SMSs, and then to wrap up as well. So, Ziba in Secunda, morning.
Yes. Yeah, morning. Yeah, the colonizers are Anglo-American, De Beers, and Oppenheimer. Chinese are helping the continent. This talk of China colonizing Africa is coming from Europeans and Americans who've seen competition now from China. Europe has exploited Africa for a long, long time, and as usual, we Africans, we are very stupid and sleepy. We allow these people to tell us what to say, and we continue with that. Oppenheimer has been exporting our minerals to Israel, to Antwerp. Antwerp is the world capital of diamonds, but they are coming from Johannesburg. And we let him go, continue. 20 years after independence in 1994, right. China is better than Europe.
Okay.
Full stop.
Thanks, Ziba. That's Ziba in Secunda. I'll give my guests a chance to respond in a moment.
Hello?
All right.
Can I respond?
Yeah, let me start with Yeju. Let's do that. And then Herbert, I'll give you
I agree with previous callers, because we have many ways to realize potential benefits from these Chinese investments in a direct way, as one of our the previous callers mentioned. Like African consumers can afford cheaper items actually made in China, and indirectly infrastructure that Chinese investment is bringing to the continent. That is what African countries need urgently for further development. So that's my response.
And I mean, what Mutala was saying about the historical relationship and the fact that in the past, China helped a lot of African countries, particularly during the Cold War.
Well, in the historical aspect, I'm not really good at, but I really want. I rather want to focus on the future, future relations between China and Africa.
And let's talk a bit about the future before I give Herbert a chance to respond as well. How do you see this relationship evolving?
Sorry?
What do you expect to happen in the future with this relationship that China has with Africa?
Well, I think African countries, we have, as we all know, resources, energy, and then everything. So we have leverage. So now I think for us, we have to use this, we have to focus how to regulate them. So, it's much more about African government's willingness and capacity. So that's what I want to say.
All right. Herbert?
I think the last two callers made important points, and I fully agree that the relationship with the West was unbalanced and was stacked against Africa's interests and led, in fact, to this misdevelopment that we've seen largely on the continent and this complete dependency at times. But comparing the China of the 1960s and maybe early 70s and their support for the liberation struggle in Africa to Chinese investment today is dangerous and misses the point because of the changes in China, because of the changes in the global economy, and because of the vested interest today when China enters relationships in Africa. So the way forward would be, like some of your callers have also indicated, it can only start with Africa setting its own priority and negotiating very consciously and very deliberately a different set of economic relations with China that will need to be very fundamentally different to the relations that the continent had with Europe and the US over the decades. And that requires both a political and economic agenda that is very different from the current set of rules under globalization. And I think that's where we need to start that and not say China is better than the West was. That's not necessarily true in today's economic relation. And I think that's the danger when we conflate past historic experience and we don't see how the world economy is operating today.
And is there a role in there for labor unions on the continent?
Absolutely. Trade unions have also started organizing not only at national level but also continentally and globally through global union federations, etc. And that is where you need to push framework agreements through that cover whole industries and countries and learning from this past experience and saying this will not happen again. It's a pity we didn't hear the caller from Zambia because there in the mines there were massive battles happening from mine workers against their exploitation by Western companies and also by Chinese companies in recent years, and then things have started to improve. So trade unions with their organizational power and strength definitely have a role to play.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much to both of you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Msikwi.
It's a pleasure. That's Herbert Yoch, who is a labor researcher and co-editor of the book Chinese Investments in Africa, a Labor Perspective. In fact, I forgot to ask Herbert where you can find the book. I'll do a Google search. And Yeju Kim is a research analyst at the Center for Chinese Studies based at the University of Stellenbosch. And I must apologize for Mundia Sikufele, who's with the National Union of Miners and Allied Workers in Zambia. The line was absolutely atrocious. So unfortunately, we were talking to him from Zambia and had to abandon that particular line. Some of your SMSs. Francis says, and then they expect us to take their side on issues like that of the Dalai Lama, and we do. And Sajini Enze says, let China invade Africa because Africans know nothing other than corruption and fighting for positions. And someone says, what is shocking is that white South Africans aren't allowed to work in this country, yet Chinese are awarded contracts. What? I'm sitting right in front of Keith right now. Keith is at work, and he's a white South African. He's got a job, but in this country, white people are allowed to work. Let's not generalize when we're trying to make a point. And Kurt says, looks like history repeats itself just by investments and not mirrors and hairbrushes. Mirrors and hairbrushes. Mirrors and hairbrushes. Mirrors and hairbrushes. Mirrors and hairbrushes.